Okay, good evening. Today I'm going to talk about collecting monster magazines in the 1970s. Bit of a specialist subject, so not of interest to everyone, I understand. The reason I'm doing this is about 6 years ago we published our very first book. It was called 70s Monster Memories, and it was looking at all aspects of growing up in the 70s. Super 8 cine film, model kits, books, posters, magazines, all this kind of thing. And it was an immediate success. We sold out the entire run of the book in less than 3 months. You can get a copy of it on eBay. The cheapest one I found was £99.95 plus postage. I hasten to add that's not me selling that. I wish it was. I'd make a fortune. Unfortunately, with all these things, you get people who are just scammers. They're not real fans at all. Anyway, about a year and a half ago, we reprinted it with a new cover by Brooks. This is the reprint version. And this one sold out in about 2 weeks. It was incredible. So what we're going to do in the next couple of weeks, we're hoping to launch a digital version of the book. And it won't just be like a Kindle thing. It'll be the actual book, all 408 pages in full glorious colour. And because that's one of the big advantages of this book. And those of you who've seen it or have read it, you'll see, like, you'll get all this wonderful colour pages can be downloaded directly onto your phone, your tablet, your computer, whatever. So that's our big plans for the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to make a series of videos, and tonight I want to talk about monster magazines. I remember being a kid in the 70s and the excitement of taking the train to my local town, coming out the station and rushing down the hill to get to the second-hand shop where I used to buy all my movie tie-ins from. And it seems, in those days, between the mid and late 70s, almost every week there was a new magazine coming out covering monster movies and horror movies. I remember though the very first one I ever bought was Monster Mag #1. Monster Mag, it folded out into this huge poster. I don't have any Monster Mags to hand to show you. But every Saturday I would go to the local news agents with my mum when I was like 10, 11 years old. And they would have a rack there, this metal rack, I remember it very clearly, where they would have all the latest Marvel and DC comics. And the ones I would love, those old DC ones like The House of Secrets and The House of Mystery, The Unexplained, The Witching Hour, that kind of thing. Well, this particular Saturday, it was probably 1974, went in there, and then in the rack was stuffed this big magazine, Monster Mag, and on the cover was a picture of Christopher Lee from Taste of Blood of Dracula with completely red eyes, and then emblazoned across the top, for sale to adults only. I still to this day don't know how I persuaded my mum to buy that for 15p, but she did, and that was the start of a lifelong love of all things horror. And Monster Mag was great. You would get them and you would stick them on your wall, and because it'd fold out into this huge poster. And but it was only one of many. Now, most of the magazines we got in the UK were from the States, they were imports from the US. And probably the most famous of all, of course, is Famous Monsters of Filmland, which had been around since 1958. And certainly where I lived in the northeast of England, you didn't get Famous Monsters. It just wasn't there for some reason. I did, over the course of the 70s, pick up a few issues of Famous Monsters by writing to different people who had advertised in the back of House of Hammer magazine, and I managed to get them that way. But I never really liked their. They didn't really take the films that seriously. It was all very jokey and silly puns and everything. And I think you have to realise there was a big difference back then between the United States and the UK, because in the US, these films were for kids. Kids were allowed to go and see all these horror films, and the publicity was all aimed at the kids as well. Whereas in the UK we weren't. They were all X certificates, so you weren't allowed to go and see these movies. So the nearest thing we could get would be buy books and magazines and pore over all these photographs from these horror films. So a lot of imitations, because Famous Monsters was very successful. Many of the imitations not very good, to be honest. And they would magazines would come and go. Some of them were only one issue, some of them a few issues, some lasted a little bit longer. Most of them, as I say, not very good at all. But to a teenager, to a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, we didn't really care about those things. It was just getting the magazines. Now, one of them was this one, Quasimodo's Monster Magazine. It was a very jokey affair, and the paper that it's printed on, not very good quality paper. The photograph reproduction, not very good either. But you know, we didn't care because it had up to date films like The Land That Time Forgot and The Exorcist, and it also looked at a classic horror. It didn't always do it in a very serious way, it has to be said. But you know, as kids, we really didn't care. This ran for a number of issues. This is actually, believe it or not, this is probably the best cover they did. The other covers are not that great, to be honest. But I quite like this cover, and one of the many that came and then just disappeared. Another one that I actually did like was For Monsters Only. Now, this was by the people who did Cracked magazine, which is kind of itself was a rip-off of Mad magazine. And For Monsters Only, most of their issues were just a series of jokes and silly cartoons and you know, this kind of thing. Again, not taking things seriously. But the last couple of issues did have some quite good articles in it. One issue has a great cover of Vincent Price in Scream and Scream Again, and this one I love. For no other reason than it features Trog, one of my favourite films, on the cover. And inside, bit of an article about the film Trog, which, I don't know, some people will try and tell you is an awful film, but I think it's on a par with Casablanca and Citizen Kane, to be honest. But you know, I have strange taste. But but these couple of later issues were great. And by the way, you know, I always loved a magazine that had a good painted cover. I've always loved that, and which is why when I launched We Belong Dead, and when we do our books and our magazines, I always insist we have a painted cover, and we're very lucky that we have some amazing artists who do our books and our magazine covers. So that was For Monsters Only. That was another one. One of the better ones was called Movie Monsters. There were only 4 issues of this magazine. This was issue number 1, and it's a lovely painting, actually, very simple but lovely painting of Harryhausen's Cyclops from Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And other covers, I think there was a Phantom of the Opera one, and there was a Planet of the Apes one, and then there was this one, which is a kind of an interpretation of a thing from another world. Again, these were a mixture of silliness, jokes, and some quite serious articles. But you know, at the time, it seemed like every week a new magazine was coming out, and we couldn't get enough of it. You know, we'd grab all these magazines, and it was a golden time, really, to be growing up. Now, there were other magazines that weren't necessarily specifically about horror movies or monster movies, but sometimes occasionally feature them. I remember even Look and Learn. My mum would insist if I wanted to get my Spider-Man Weekly and my other horror stuff, I had to also get Look and Learn, which actually was a great magazine when you think about it. But even Look and Learn did a whole thing about Dracula and vampire films and stuff. And then this one was very good. The Story of the Movies. It was like one of these part work things. You would, each issue you would build up. You would buy the binder to put them all in. And it's where I learnt a lot about Hollywood, about directors, about actors, about everything associated with movies. It instilled in me a real love of cinema. And I still have them all in a binder, and a few spare copies as well. But every issue they would have a section movie themes. So as you can see, this one is vampires. I actually, even though I just said I loved the painted covers, which I did, I actually love this cover. Here you have Christopher Lee being staked in Dracula's Risen from the Grave, and then with his glaring red eyes from Taste of Blood of Dracula. This is the same picture, by the way, that appeared on the cover of that very first Monster Mag. And then inside we have movie themes, vampires. So they look at Nosferatu, Lugosi's Dracula, Vampire, Dracula's Daughter, Hammer's Dracula of 1958, Dance of the Vampires, Blackula, and for some strange reason, Andy Warhol's Blood for Dracula. I'm not quite sure why that one is in there. That's the binder that you could get to put all your issues in. Now, you ask most British people of a certain age their favourite magazine, and they're going to tell you the House of Hammer magazine. And this was launched by Des Skin. Now, Des Skin, he did the last few issues of Monster Mag, but he felt very restricted by the format of the poster magazine, because there was only a certain number of pages you could do articles. You couldn't really do in-depth articles, so that's why he decided to launch this. So this is the very first issue, which covers Hammer's 1958 Dracula. And the idea of House of Hammer was that each issue would cover a specific Hammer film in comic strip form. And as I mentioned before, you have to realise that in the UK, we were not allowed to go and see these films at the cinema. And a lot of them still weren't making their way to TV at this point. So this was the nearest we got to owning an actual movie. It was obviously the days long before video and DVD and Blu-ray. And it was a mixture of articles, lots of great writers, John Brosnan, David Peary, Dennis Gifford, some very, very interesting articles, and also coverage of the then up-to-date movies and the new stuff that was coming out. And it's in the pages of House of Hammer that I first heard of people such as Dario Argento, Jean Rollin, Paul Naschy, people I'd never heard of before. So, wonderful magazine. And again, the artwork is fabulous here. Most of the covers were done by Brian Lewis. Beautiful, beautiful paintings. This is a Father Shandor one. Plague of the Zombies. And what was a really nifty thing to us as kids is you would have this beautiful painted cover, but on the back you would have the original movie poster for the film. This one is a very good one as well, Twins of Evil. Great Cushing one there. Again, another Brian Lewis. But my favourite, and I tell Des this all the time, he also lives in Brighton, so we often meet up for coffee and chat and catch up. And I always tell him, this, in my opinion, was the best cover that they ever did. Brian Lewis cover for issue number 4 for The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. And again, containing the comic strip and lots of other great stuff. There's a great article in here, actually, about monsters from the East. And I'd never seen any Japanese horror movies at that point. I'd seen the stills in Gifford's book, but this was a great magazine, and it's still one of my favourites. It's not my number one favourite, unlike most British fans, but I'll come to that in a moment. Now, my favourite one from the United States, as I said, there were lots of rip-offs coming there, and lots of them were not very good quality, but this one was produced by Marvel, and it's a fantastic magazine. It was it didn't live for very long, but I have all the issues still, and it's wonderful. It's Monsters of the Movies, and just look at that cover. A beautiful painting there, Monsters of the Movies. And this took things a little bit more serious than Famous Monsters and all the other rip-offs. This had some very in-depth articles, very, very interesting articles. And again, the covers are just amazing. They're beautiful. It's what draws you in. And, every week going to the shop, looking out for a new cover there. There's issue number 2 with Karloff as the Frankenstein monster. Lovely one for issue 3. You have Lee's Count. You have Jonathan Frid as Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows. And William Marshall as Blackula. I just love the colours used in this one. But I think of the Monsters of the Movies, my favourite was issue number 7. And the reason was, issue 7, I don't know if you can see this, covered Horror of Dracula, as it was known in the States. We just knew it as Dracula, of course. Hammer's original 1958 version. And in those days, before VHS or anything, this was the closest we could come to actually owning the film. Again, another wonderful painting on the cover. I'm not sure about, starring Christopher Lee and Pete Cushing. I don't think I ever heard anyone call him Pete Cushing, but, there you go. Wonderful, wonderful magazine. Which brings us to my favourite magazine of all, which is a British publication. And this actually had photographs for the cover. And actually, it kind of works. It kind of works. It's a very strange one, I have to say. It's a strange mixture of esoteric material, of some fiction. There's even some Chetwin Hayes stuff in there, and a review of new films at the time, things like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, even musical theatre. I remember one of the articles is about the musical version of Jack the Ripper, which was on the London stage in the on about 1976. But this magazine was called The World of Horror, and this was the very first issue. What was great about it is colour, because a lot of these magazines just were in black and white. So to get stuff in colour, wow, this was incredible. You know, we couldn't believe it really. That was the first issue. So they used sometimes stills from films, sometimes TV. This one, I have no idea where this cover comes from. It's not the best cover, but it's kind of striking in its own way. And we have, what's this, issue 2. This is Lee from Scars of Dracula. And this one I love. It's Vincent Price as Fives. This is issue number 6. And again, lots of colour stuff in there. A feature on The Exorcist, and you know, often with these magazines though, it was the ads inside as well, which were great. You know, ads for 8mm cine films, for model kits, for paperback books, for other magazines. You know, it was glorious. It was really glorious. They covered a lot of TV stuff as well. Star Trek, too much Star Trek. I never really got into Star Trek, I'll be honest with you. Classical Doctor Who. There's an hologram on the cover there of issue number 3. Was very apt. King Kong for Prime Minister. I think he'd actually be doing a better job right now than the job that we have as Prime Minister. And I love this cover as well. I think it's from Battle for the Planet of the Apes. And again, lots of great stuff in there. Lots of colour as well. You know, and we kind of take that for granted these days, but back then it was a big thing. Also, as far as I know, the only magazine ever to have a cover featuring Sheila Keith, and an interview with her in the magazine. Sadly, the magazine, as I say, didn't last. This was actually the last issue, so it only ran to 9 issues, and then abruptly disappeared. And in those days, you just don't know what happened. You know, these things would come and then it would go. As simple as that. But anyway, that's just a rundown of some of my favourite monster magazines from the 70s. And when I launched We Belong Dead back in the 90s, it was kind of in homage to these magazines, because back then there wasn't really any magazines covering the classic age of horror from like the silence to the 70s. It was all gore films and slasher films. And so, you know, that's kind of one of the reasons we launched We Belong Dead. And, you know, we're still going strong, so we must be doing something right. And as I say, you know, this book, we are going to relaunch it in a digital format in the coming weeks. And leading up to that, we will make, I will make a few more little videos looking at things such as horror film books of the 70s and monster model kits of the 70s as well. So if there's any subjects you'd like me to talk about, please feel free to leave a comment. Also, let me know what your favourite horror movie magazines were growing up as well. And we'll be back very soon with another instalment. So have a very good evening. Good night.